What I want to do here is focus on a more advanced use case of GlyphWorks because there's some stuff we can't cover in a training class, in the beginner's training class, that is useful. And we talk about sometimes by email or over the phone on the support hotline. And I just want to cover this in the next half hour, how we can link together Excel and GlyphWorks. Chris Poza from Ford Transmission was talking about exporting results from GlyphWorks and looking at them in Excel, statistical plots, tables, that kind of stuff. I actually want to look at getting stuff into GlyphWorks from Excel rather than getting out. Rather than getting stuff out of GlyphWorks, I want to get stuff into GlyphWorks from Excel. So what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about how we do things and then show how we do those. As much as possible, I would like to focus on doing live stuff in this session today. Okay, so what are we talking about? How to use GlyphWorks to read data or metadata into GlyphWorks. All right, so let's make sure we understand what this means. Data or metadata. Who's ever used an Excel input glyph? Okay, good. All right. All right, so those of you who haven't, you're going to learn a bit. Those of you who have, maybe you'll find something new along the way. Say I have this spreadsheet right here, okay? And you know, everyone's got a spreadsheet, right? And the question that people have is, can GlyphWorks work with Excel files? Answer is absolutely. The next question is, what the heck? What does that mean? When you say work with, what does that mean? You say, well, I have data in my spreadsheet. Okay, no doubt, we all do. Like numbers and words and letters and things, we have data. Great, you know? So the detail here now is what can we get, like what are we expecting Excel to have in there, and what is GlyphWorks going to do with it? Metadata, or possibly data, one or the other. I'm going to talk about reading metadata in several ways. I'm going to talk about reading data in one way. Data, very simple. This might be all my channel data. This might be time and then channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, and so on. And someone's been analyzing door slams like Kyle from TTC talked about, from Toyota. He talked about how they got to the point where it was just awfully hard to do all that analysis with door slams in Excel. He had all the data in Excel. Okay, now what? Can't get the analysis done, don't have the horsepower in Excel. Let's get into GlyphWorks. So we'll talk first about reading data. Secondly, we'll talk about reading metadata, project information. Who was the test engineer? What was the weather like that day? And so on. All this can be useful for traceability's sake and also for calculation's sake. So we call this not data, but metadata. Okay, so if you're doing buzzword bingo, metadata is a good square to get because we say it all the time with GlyphWorks, right? We talk about metadata a lot. Okay, so let's talk first about working with data. All right, so we have a spreadsheet. I'll show you this in just a second. We have this spreadsheet. It's got a time column. It's got channels in columns afterwards. This doesn't need to be a constant time step. It could be like a very discontinuous timestamp, now and later, and not much long after that, and a whole lot longer afterwards, and so on. Or it might just be at 100 hertz. Who knows? But we need a time column, and we need channel data in other columns. So rather than showing it this way, let me just do this live. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, and I've got, in the available data window right here, I've got some Excel, a couple of Excel spreadsheets. And this one is conveniently labeled time series data for GlyphWorks. Okay, so that sounds important for this. I'm going to drag this in like this, and I get an Excel input glyph. Again, this is the case of I have channel data in Excel, but I want to do some analysis in GlyphWorks because Excel doesn't have a fatigue calculation or a rainfall cycle count algorithm or an FFT algorithm or whatever. It doesn't have that stuff. All right, so I drag this in. I'm going to pop open this, look at Glyph Properties. Let's take a look at this a little bit bigger. So what we have here is various ways we can configure this glyph. Are we going to read metadata? That's this over here. We're going to get to that in a little bit. Right now we're going to read what we call multi-column, columns of data. Read columns of data. So now this is asking where does the data sit? Obviously, that channel data could reside anywhere in any number of spreadsheets. any different workbook, any different location on a sheet. So I need to provide that information now. So if I pop this open, if I click on any one of these little browse buttons here, I get this pop-up. This is my Excel spreadsheet. In my case, I happen to have a time column, line pressure in megapascals, ambient temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and flow rate in GPM. So this is from a pump or something. This is not strain data, but it's some kind of pump data. So it asks me, where does the data, where do the squiggly line values start? So I'm going to highlight this right here. That's where the data starts. It puts the range in here for me. Click OK. Notice it says process until first empty row. In other words, it's going to start there, and the squiggly lines follow going downward. And it may go down 100 rows. In my case, it was like 6, not very much time series data. Maybe 100 rows, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,000,000, who knows? However much data Excel can store, it's going to keep reading until it gets to an empty line and say, OK, this must be the end of it. Up here, I have some lines for ways to read in descriptors. So I'm going to tell it that the names of the channels go there. They're there in my spreadsheet. The units that the channels were collected in sit right here. So it's going to get some information about what channels, and then the actual channel values come out right here. Click OK. That produces what we call multi-column data. Hopefully by looking at that spreadsheet, you can see where the word multi-column comes from. Column of time, column channel 1, column channel 2, column channel 3, so on and so forth. So now I can do things like, repetition is key here, XYZ display glyph. I can connect this like this, run this. This is interrogating Excel right now, and it's going to pop up. If I used a data values display glyph like this one, we'll find out that we have a table of numbers that was the same as it was in Excel. Nothing new. This is just says, congratulations, read some data out of Excel. Great. So that is not terribly interesting in its own right, but what's cooler is we can do things like now do a plot like this. So Excel does an exceedingly poor job of making 3D plots like this. So in my case here now I can plot out ambient temperature versus line pressure, and then there's flow rate. I'm going to put flow rate on here as well. So the X column, it assumes column 1 is the X, column Y is column, 1, 2, 3 that way. I'm going to pick up flow rate here. So now we have a plot of temperature as affected by flow rate and pressure. Okay, so I'm reading channel data directly out of an Excel spreadsheet. Now you may wonder, wait a minute, haven't we seen enough of XYZ display today? And I agree. We've seen it a couple times now. Psychologists say that if you say something once, or if you're talking about something in general, 20% of people will know what's going on. They'll catch it the first time. 70% will need to hear it twice. And 5% will never even know anyone even talked. So this is your repetition. So anyway, you may not need to plot this stuff. What I'm saying is it's data inside GlyphWorks. If we wanted to do things like signal processing, all these other glyphs in here, frequency spectrum, rainfall cycle counting, fatigue, if we had data in Excel, strain gauge data, for example, in Excel, and we need to do things with it inside GlyphWorks, all of these have time series input pads, whereas this one is called multi-column. So just as a formatting thing, I can use a glyph here called multi-column to time series, this one, which will resample based on the first column being the time. I'm going to resample this data to, say, 100 hertz. And now this will give me time series data like we've been looking at all day long today. Data at a constant sample rate. Here is line pressure, ambient temperature, and flow rate, all as functions of time. And now all the glyphs for signal processing, time series calculator, strain life, frequency spectrum, all that stuff that we've been hearing about today, all that stuff is available now to operate on these channels. So we can talk more about that in the break if you guys want to. I want to look at something that I think is actually cooler than that, which is These are your slides, by the way, you're going to have in your handouts. I want to spend more time looking at how do we read metadata. How do we read metadata from GlyphWorks? So metadata, from Excel, I mean. How do we read metadata from Excel? Metadata in GlyphWorks is not the squiggly line, but it's information about it. So it's things like who was driving the vehicle that day, and what's the ID of the component on test, and so on. This stuff can be very useful for traceability's sake. It can also be very useful for calculating things. So I want to show ways that this glyph can read in metadata. There are 3 very specific ways. So I'm going to step through 3 different things here. So first off, metadata inside Excel. Reading metadata from Excel. So metadata can be used for calculations. I just said that. It can be used for adding to reports. It can be used for traceability's sake. Metadata all throughout GlyphWorks can be test-specific or channel-specific. What I mean by that is certain things like the vehicle we collected data on. All channels have that same descriptor, right? That metadata is what we call test metadata, right? The weather affected every channel the same way, right? There may be other parameters that are channel-specific, like what was the sample rate? What's the name of the channel? What, in a fatigue calculation, what material are we using for this strain gauge? So there's channel-specific things and test-specific things, metadata. And it's really important to think about the difference as we move forward to using Excel to bring in metadata. So here's an example of bringing in test metadata. I'm actually going to show, rather than doing this by slides, I'm going to go back over here to GlyphWorks, and I'm going to open up a process I put together earlier called GlyphWorks Metadata from Excel. If you like this process, remember you can go back to your desk and use it. It's on your USB stick. So this, we'll go over to this one, test metadata. Okay. So what I've got here is this is some time series data. I don't care what time series data it is. I've got a spreadsheet that defines some things for it, provides some traceability for it. In this Excel input glyph, I've told it I'm reading test metadata in this cell range. So let's just pop this up. We're going to look at it together. That cell range is right here. This says that I have the vehicle is called a LTX 4x4. Engineer is Albert Einstein. Put him on the job because we need it done right. Project number, some number, so on and so forth. Tire rolling radius, some other number. So the construct here is, for this pile of data I've collected, keywords and values go together. Okay? So we have this record. You might have a spreadsheet like this. It's going to be arranged like this, where keyword on the left and value on the right. So tire rolling radius in the column A, 18.32 inches in column B. So I would select this range, say OK again. When I run this, we'll find out that green metadata, this is essentially pieces of information. This is squiggly lines. This glyph is called metadata manipulation. It puts them together. It says, take this information and tag it onto these squiggly lines. So I now find under test metadata for GlyphWorks here, we always have attributes. Here's a new one, Excel input 1. The engineer is Albert Einstein. Tire rolling radius is 18.32. So the metadata is under test, a section of metadata called Excel input 1. That's the name of the input glyph. And then these are the keyword value pairs that I had stored in Excel. This now means that if I want to have a report that does all this stuff for me, and at the top says the project engineer was somebody, I have a reference now to who that somebody was. So I can refer to metadata. How is metadata referred to inside GlyphWorks, by the way, in a report? How do you refer to metadata in a glyph or inside a report? Pound signs around it, right? So now I have the ability to refer to engineer, and whoever the engineer is in the spreadsheet, that gets carried through. So my report might say engineered by da-da-da-da, this kind of stuff. Okay? Also, now I have a tire rolling radius, so if I had wheel torque and I wanted to get tractive effort from that, wheel torque divided by rolling radius gives me tractive effort. So I can use a time series calculator, say torque divided by tire rolling radius equals tractive effort. And pick up that tire rolling radius there directly. So I can use it for reports, or I can use it for calculations. These answers here are fixed no matter what data file I give it. The Excel spreadsheet says this information, this metadata is tagged on here no matter what data file I'm working with. And you may say, hey, wait a minute. What if I have something like a different driver or different conditions for every run, right? What if I have a little table that instead of saying here's the engineer or here's the driver, here are the conditions, what if that varies run by run, okay? So we can extend this into a lookup table. Right now this is fixed. It says all data files will pick up this information for us to use later. We can extend this and make this into a lookup table by doing this. We can say, what if we have a table like this that says, for these data files, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have some information like a description, ballast condition, number of repeats, comments, and so on. So I can put together this table here. This is going to be a lookup table. If I ever come across a file called this, it's going to use this information. Keyword, value, and so on. If I ever come across this data file, it's going to know to use this. So this is the key here now. This is the key to the lookup table. Right? So I'll show you an example of how this works. That looks like this. So I've got my same metadata spreadsheet. I put that down here. Take one of these data files, put it in like this. Show you what this glyph is set up to look like. Here, this says we're reading test metadata in this area. So let's just pop that up. We can take a look at it. This is where my test lookup metadata sits. It's a table here. This is the keyword. This is the value for this file. Really important, multi-test table. That's like saying this is a lookup. This is a lookup. So the table will provide different metadata depending on what data file I'm working with currently. This is interesting because now I have down here in the metadata comments, description, payload, repeats, and so on. Or to make it a little bit more eye-candy-ish, I put that into a studio report here. So this studio report says the file I'm working on right now is called ATV12 digging. The run description is digging ditch. That was read out of Excel. That was read out of Excel. That was read out of Excel. If I change the data file I'm working with, if I remove that data file and put in one called transport, rerun this, you'll see that this has updated now to say not just the name of the file has changed, but other information about that as well. So this could be just for reporting sake like this, just so the header of my report has the appropriate information filled in. It could be for fatigue calculations. It could be repeats information. Take damage per run and multiply by the number of repeats, and the number of repeats changes on whether I'm doing this transport run or a backfilling run or so on. Is this making sense here? Okay. How many people have used this, what we call test lookup, for metadata inside GlyphWorks? Okay. All right, good. Okay. So let's look at this a different way now. Another way to look at this is let's extend this concept of looking up. Right now we're looking up by data file. Let's extend this to look up by channel instead, because we might have channel-specific things to worry about. Classic use case for this is a fatigue calculation. We're doing a fatigue calculation. We need to worry about material properties. Howard, you're nodding your head because you talked about this last year, didn't you? So with a fatigue calculation, we have to specify material properties inside a given glyph. And we may say then that this glyph, we're doing fatigue calculation on a cast aluminum, for example. So all strain gauges that pass through that glyph will be assumed have an SN curve or an EN curve for cast aluminum. But then you say, hey, wait a minute. I only have 3 gauges on a cast aluminum part. I actually have several near a weld, a couple others on a carburized tube of steel, so on and so forth. So how do we deal with channel-based calculations? Could use multiple glyphs, set a material property in each glyph, and use a test splitter to get the right channels to the right glyphs. That's fine. Another way to do it is what I'm going to show you right here, which is looking up channel-based metadata and then having a glyph refer to it. So the idea here, in this third use case, is, let's go back here. The idea here is, this time, we're going to have a channel-based table of metadata. If we ever find a channel called 90, its material is this. Channel 91, its material is that. You can use any words you want to up here. That's just the keyword. You can use any value you want in here. That's just the value that's carried around. So if you wanted to have a column here called magic number with random numbers in it, it's great. You know what? Now you can have them in GlyphWorks. You have a piece of metadata called magic number, and it's got numbers attached to it. I don't care what you call them. There's nothing magic to the naming here. The point is it's a table of rows representing channels and columns representing metadata values. And then we can use these inside a fatigue calculation. So I'll show you what this looks like. That's this tab right here. For those of you that can't see in the back of the room, what I'm using is multiple workspaces here at the bottom, just like tabs in an Excel spreadsheet. It's your choice whether you want to have one GlyphWorks process with multiple tabs in it to do different things, or multiple GlyphWorks flows with one tab each. It's your choice. I like to have 3 of them together here because they do about the same thing but with a little twist. All right, so this time I'm going to grab a data file, and I'm going to grab my Excel spreadsheet, pop that in here, look at the properties. This time it says we're going to work with channel metadata, and it sits in this range. So let's go look at that, pop this up. We have this range. Turn off my zoom. Here it is down here. Channel information sits right here. Channel 90 gets this material. 91 gets that material, so on and so forth. So fill that list in. Multi-channel table. And the channel number is the king. The lookup, so it's a multi-channel table. Channel number is the king. So in other words, what's consistent about your data? Channel numbering or channel naming? Channel numbering or channel naming, whichever one's consistent there. We'll grab that when we run the calculation. This says squiggly lines of strain. This says information about that on a channel basis. Put the two together. The strain life glyph, look at its properties in here. We've got this. A number of you guys have probably used this glyph before. So now we have things like the material is called pound Excel input 1.material pound. From the Excel spreadsheet, put in the name for each channel separately, substitute in at runtime what is the name of the material. What is the KF value to use? What is the offset or residual stress that's not accounted for in the squiggly line? So this is going to be done on a per channel basis, and we can see that when the process runs down here in our fatigue calculations. Now we have different KFs, different materials, different offsets, all giving channel-specific fatigue lives. You don't have to do this. Anything having to do with metadata, you don't have to do. But this is a clear way in which you can extend the processing power in GlyphWorks from doing things manually to doing things in an automated way. So the use of metadata is a clear differentiator between getting started and really extending the use of GlyphWorks capabilities. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just see, what was it we were supposed to be talking about? What we were supposed to be talking about, we just talked about this reading and channel metadata. I just showed that. So the whole idea of this presentation was to look at how we could read either channel data or metadata from GlyphWorks. So questions or comments that haven't already been brought up about that?